Okay, hi, hello. Take 583. That's what it feels like. It's really take 3 officially of the stream. So, my name is Kristen. FireTowerKnits is my channel. You might hear my baby in the background. She just woke up from a nap and she's grumpy. So, I've been knitting for a little over 15 years, and that is my expertise. Streaming, not so much. But we're going to figure it out and we're going to make this a regular thing. I'm hoping to do a stream every Sunday. So, Sunday Stitches stream. It may happen more often than that. I also host a Facebook group. We call ourselves the Stitch and Bitch Circle. And we get together on Facebook Messenger rooms, which is kind of like a Zoom, where everyone can log in and we all work on crafts. It is not knitting specific, although there are knitters in that group. But we all get together and chat and craft and talk about what's going on in our lives and tell funny stories and that sort of thing. So if you're interested in that, look us up, Stitch and Bitch Circle on Facebook, and I'll post a link. Actually, I just realized I don't have a link to that in my Twitch profile, so I'll put a link to that in my Twitch profile later today. But for Twitch streaming, knitting is fun and it's fun for people to watch. And so I'm just going to be working on different projects. And if you have any questions or anything you specifically want to see, like how to cast on or how to do a specific stitch or how to read something in a pattern, feel free to leave me a message or send a comment, and I can get to different requests. But yeah, so let's work on some things. Earlier this morning, I was watching a streamer on Twitch. I think her username was My Cookie, and she was teaching herself how to knit with some diagrams in a Learn to Knit kit, which honestly I was super impressed. She got the hang of it really fast. She's a crocheter normally, and just reading off these diagrams, she was able to teach herself not only to knit but also to cable, which is really quite impressive. So she did a really good job. But she was having some difficulty with the casting on, which is normal because casting on is super tricky. There's lots of different ways to cast on. There's no one specific way. So I'm just going to show you two techniques. If you're a crocheter and you can't figure out how to cast on, just use your crochet hook and you can single crochet a row of however many stitches the knitting pattern calls for, and then you can just knit them onto your knitting needle. So if that makes you comfortable, you're more than welcome to do that. That's also how you can do a provisional cast on if it's something that you want to take out later. But I'm going to show you two techniques. The first one I'll show you is what I call as a knitted cast on. So you just make a slip knot in your yarn, and then let's see, I'm going to use these needles. Then you put that on your needle. Put your slip knot on your needle. And then put that in your left hand. And then you're just going to knit on additional stitches, which is why it's called the knitted cast on. So you just put your needle in your loop, go ahead and knit a stitch, and then slip it back onto your left hand needle. So I'll show you that again. Insert your needle, and instead of slipping it off like you would do if you were knitting, you just put that loop back onto the left needle. So now we have 3. And you just keep doing that until you have the number of stitches that your pattern asks for. And it's a little hinky as you do it, and that's okay. One of the main tips of casting on, no matter how you decide to cast on, you want to make it loose. You don't want your cast on stitches to be super tight, because then that first row of knitting is going to be pretty impossible. You want them pretty loose, and they're already going to be a little bit tighter than the rest of your knitting just because your cast on stitches are they're just tighter. They just are. But try to make it loose, but not so loose that the stitches are falling off the needle. There's no need to really pull on that yarn and make it super tight. Just let it be loose. So that's the knitted cast on. You can just keep adding stitches as you go. I really like knitted cast-ons for like when you're in the middle of a project and if it's something that you know, has a bobble or a buttonhole, like if you bound off a couple stitches and now you're coming back and you need to put those stitches back on. I really like the knitted cast on for things like that, for adding stitches in the middle of a project. For me, they function the best. They're not too loose. They're not fiddly whenever your knitted garment is completed. I just like that technique. So that's knitted cast on. Now let me move. I'm looking at my camera and it's making my stitches a little funky. We'll have to mess with the lighting later. Today's big effort was actually streaming, getting the stream to work, and B, getting the microphone to work, because for a while there no one could hear me. So we have jumped over those two hurdles, and next hurdle will be lighting, because I can tell the lighting is making my stitches kind of blurry right now. So we'll work on that, and then doing something fancy to my theme, because I don't know how to do all of that. So my if you have any suggestions about how to make my Twitch stream a little bit more fancy, feel free to send me a message. I'm just using OBS right now. We were trying to use what was the other one called? Also OBS, but Streamlabs, I guess. Anyway, it was not happy. It was unhappy. It did not like my microphone. We tried to use this microphone, and we also tried to use the mic on my laptop, and it didn't want to do either of those things, and it was just generally displeased. So we switched to OBS, and now it's working. Everything looks fine, but there's no frills to it. There's no theme. I can't see the chat in OBS, so I have the chat open on my phone, which I think is probably fine, but I'm sure there's a better way to do it. So you Twitch experts, feel free, send me a message, let me know what I'm doing wrong, give me some advice. The other type of cast on, this is the one that I learned when I first learned how to knit. It's trickier. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's extra stretchy. So think about, like, for the edge of a hat or a sock, you want to have a stretchy cast on edge. So this is called the long tail cast on. Now, the reason it's called a long tail cast on is because you have to have a long tail. So if you only need to cast on about 10 stitches, then your tail doesn't need to be so long. You know, this'll do, this length will do. But if you need to cast on 100 stitches, you have to pull out a bunch. Your tail needs to be super long. And yes, I have cast on like 98 stitches and didn't have enough yarn to finish the last two. And then I had to undo the whole thing and do it all over again. It's super annoying, but very stretchy cast on. So this is the long tail cast on. So what you do is you put the tail end of your yarn over your thumb, and then put the other end of your yarn that's connected to your ball over your pointer. You hold those two ends together with the rest of your fingers. Then you use your needle. You come from the top, let's see. You loop under your thumb, around your finger, and then through the thumb hole again. And then you just continue that. Now, this, you can find tutorials, YouTube tutorials, with much slower videos on how to do this. Just look up long tail cast on. I believe Knitpicks has some tutorials about this. But if you just Google it, you will find people who are much better at describing this over a video camera than I am. But this is kind of my go-to cast on, is the long tail cast on. And this was the first one I learned, so it's not tricky to me anymore, but it's very tricky to teach someone. It's a little complicated, but I like it. It's a good cast on. It makes a nice, even cast on edge. But again, like with any knitted cast on, you want to make sure that the stitches aren't too tight. My husband is in my Twitch chat. Thank you, Jacques, for actually typing something in there so I can see that the chat is working. So now I'm going to just show a couple basic stitches. So the knit stitch is, of course, the first stitch that you learn. And you just insert your needle from front to back within that first loop. Wrap your yarn around the right hand needle counterclockwise. Pull the yarn through and push the loop off your left hand needle. Again, there are a whole bunch of people online doing tutorials and lessons. This is not really meant to be either of those. More of a confirmation of you're doing it right. This is how you knit. And if you were to knit every single row, you would make the knit pattern called garter. Garter stitch is when you're knitting flat and you knit every row. So we'll do a few rows of that. You know, this yellow yarn, I think it's Lion Brand. It's a nice basic yarn. It's acrylic. Acrylic yarn is machine washable and dryable. It's not gonna felt up on you or do anything funky. But this yellow yarn does not like my lighting. It's kind of reflecting the light off in an odd way. So I think next time I stream, I'll make sure that I don't use this bright yellow acrylic. I wonder if the problem is the acrylic, or if the problem is that it's bright yellow, or if the problem is that the light is too close. I'm not sure which. But yeah, this is just, I'm knitting every row. So this is garter stitch. The benefits of garter stitch is that it lays flat. So I'll show you in a little bit. Stockinette stitch curls. It doesn't matter how you're doing it. It doesn't matter if you're knitting really loose or really tight or what kind of yarn you're using. Stockinette curls. Garter stitch does not curl. Garter stitch lays flat and it's kind of bumpy. Let's see if we get closer, if the camera will like that. Yeah, the camera likes that. All right, we're learning our camera. So garter stitch is kind of bumpy. It has a nice, I like it, a nice even but bumpy texture. And it's a flat stitch. So if you are, let's say you're starting a hat, you want to do the first few rows in garter stitch maybe, so that your brim doesn't roll up. Or if you're knitting a scarf or a shawl, garter stitch is a nice stitch because your scarf or your shawl is not going to roll up. Also, whenever you're doing other stitches, sometimes it's nice to do garter stitch just on the edges. So you might do the first 2 or 3 stitches in each row, knit for all rows. And that way your edges at least aren't going to curl up. And then the rest of your stitches can be whatever pattern you've chosen. Oops, come back here. So let's finish this row with some garter stitch. And I'll give you a little trick. If you're knitting in the round, using circular needles or double points, and you're trying to do garter stitch, instead of stitch every row, you have to stitch one row and then purl one row and then stitch and then purl. So when you're knitting in the round, things are a little bit backwards. So let's talk about stockinette stitch, which is what you think of when you think of knitting. Stockinette stitch is when you knit one row and then you purl a row. And purl is kind of backwards knitting. So let's see if we can make this work. Knitting is going into the loop from front to back. Purl, and you'd have to move your yarn to your front. Purl is going into that loop from back to front. So make sure your yarn is in the front. Insert a needle from back to front. Yarn over, pull through. So purl is just kind of backwards knitting from back to front. So this is purl. And do a few rows where we alternate. You might be able to hear my 4-year-old in the background. We have a 10-month-old and a 4-year-old. And my mother-in-law is doing a great job at keeping them occupied, but they're somewhat loud. I mean, I think that's probably just the existence of all children. They're just loudness is part of their being. And the 4-year-old is especially embracing his loudness. So, and there's not really so much room in our house that I can't get that far away where he won't be so loud. So apologies if you hear a tiny voice or a tiny cry in the background. So here we have one more purl row, and then I'll show you what this looks like. I almost lost that stitch. Here's how you lose a stitch. Let's not do that. So if you're wondering about these needles, I'm using circular needles, which are typically used to make circular objects like a hat or a sock or a cowl. But you don't have to use circular needles to make circular projects. You can use them back and forth to make straight projects, just like I'm doing. They're also super useful if you're making a large straight project, like a blanket. If I were knitting a blanket that had, you know, I don't know, 300, 400 stitches, a circular needle might be helpful for that because you can bunch up all your stitches around. You don't have to have, you know, straight needles that are 3 feet long. You could just use circular needles. It makes things a lot more simple. So this, let's see if the camera will be happy focusing. There we go. This top part, that is stockinette stitch. And that is when you knit one row and purl one row, and you do that back and forth. Now stockinette, like I said, stockinette stitch is kind of the what you think of when you think about knitting. There we go. That looks even better. That's the look that you think of. It's much less textured than garter stitch here. It has these nice pretty little V's. It's flat, or it looks flat anyway. But the downside of stockinette, and you're not going to be able to really see it here because I have a couple rows of garter, but it does curl. It will curl up and it will curl on the sides. So if you're making, let's say a scarf, and you want it to be this nice pretty V's stockinette stitch, we almost had a disaster, then I would suggest knitting a few rows in garter. So purl every row, 2 or 3 rows. And then when you're knitting your stockinette stitch for the rest of the scarf, doing a couple stitches of garter on each side. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. So on your knit rows on the side where you're knitting, you're just going to knit across like normal. So just knit across. Nothing weird about that. The weirdness will be on the purl sides. It's not really weird, but my yarn doesn't want to come out. It wanted to stay in the skein. So, okay, we knit across on the knit side, and it's happy. On the purl side, what you would do to make a little garter border on each side is knit a couple stitches. So we're just going to knit 2. Then you have to bring your yarn to the back, and then you purl You can purl all the way across to the last couple of stitches. So I did 2 in the front, so I'll do 2 in the back too. Purl across. Do, do, do. It helps if you sing to it. Not really, but it might make you feel better. All right, now we're at our last 2 stitches. So we're going to bring our yarn from back to the front over here, and then we'll knit our 2 stitches. Now you're not really going to be able to appreciate what that looks like yet, so we'll do 2 more rows like that. So again, we're on our knit side now. You know we're on our knit side because you have all the little V's. Look at those pretty V's. There they are. So we just knit across. We're going to knit all these stitches. Do, 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 do. I have actually 3 people watching right now. I'm pretty sure one of them is my husband. And I think perhaps one of them is me because I have my chat open. Because I don't know how else to look at my chat. I'm not sure who the 3rd person is. Alright, so we knit all the way across on our knit row. And now on our purl row. So now we're in the back. You know it's the back because it looks all bumpy. I'm going to knit the first 2 stitches. Then bring your yarn from front to back and purl all the way across. Until the last 2 stitches. So. Now I hear my dogs in the background. My goodness. You know, our house is not normally this loud, but when I'm trying to do something. All right, so now bring your yarn from back to front, and then you'll knit those last 2 stitches. And let's see. Let's show you what that looks like. So the edges, let's see here. The edges have a garter border, and then the rest is stockinette, and then a garter border. And what this does is it prevents the edges from rolling up on itself, because stockinette will roll. This nice pretty V pattern that we all like, that we think of when we're knitting, that it rolls up. It doesn't matter, or curls up. It doesn't matter how tight or loosely you knit, it curls. It's annoying. So by putting a couple stitches of garter on either side, you can prevent it from curling up. And like I said, if you want to do a whole scarf in stockinette, do the first 2 or 3 rows in garter, and then do a couple stitches on either side in garter, and then that scarf is going to lay flat when you try to wear it. I wonder if I put it up close. Let me see. We're going to try this. We're going to do a close-up this way without that crazy light. We're going to see if that looks better. No, not really, but okay, so we've got our garter edge, then our stockinette across, and then our garter edge. You know, I'll get better at this streaming thing. We'll we're learning. We're learning. We're gonna get better at it eventually. And I might use a different yarn next time, because I mean, this yarn is just, I didn't realize it was so reflective, but that's very bright, isn't it? It's not so bright down here. No, it's still pretty bright. I wonder if, just for grins, let's see. Is this yarn super bright? Yes, that is also super bright. What about this? Oh, okay, that's not quite as bright. There are some bright spots, but on the whole, it's not so bright. And this yarn is, it's probably acrylic too, but it doesn't have, the colors aren't super, super bright. This yarn, actually, I got this yarn from a sweater that I bought at Goodwill a few years ago. Pro tip, if you want to knit and you can't really afford nice yarn, go to your local Goodwill or thrift store and find some sweaters that are knit. There are tons of them. Now, some of them are machine knit and the yarn is super, super tiny. Don't get those. It'll be way too complicated to take apart. But if you find a sweater that has some thick yarn, even thicker than this, honestly, then you can. Usually, sweaters at Goodwill are like $2 or $3. There is a ton of yarn in a sweater. Let me tell you, this sweater was even a small sweater, and I got 3 giant balls of yarn out of it. So you take it home and you undo the sides, you cut up the sides, and then you can just pull the whole sweater apart and wind it into balls. It's really cool. It's a really cool way to recycle something that's not being used or worn. I have found some really beautiful yarns, merino wool and alpaca in sweaters at Goodwill, and I'm just like, I would never be able to afford this much of this kind of yarn if I were just buying the yarn. But because it's a recycled sweater, I got it for cheap. So that's where this yarn is from. That's why I don't know much about it. I know it's probably an acrylic blend and it has a lot of wild colors. And you can't see it because of the light, I don't think, but it has like a filament of a sparkly something in there. So it makes it shine. I actually, the other day, where is it? I worked on a hat. I held 2 strands of that yarn together and made a nice big thick chunky hat with it. So it's extra large and extra chunky. And it's all ribbed. So it's actually a really big hat. Like, it fits me, but it's super loose. So it can fit someone with a bigger head, which is good because my head isn't that big. So, yeah, recycled yarn from Goodwill. Pro tip, highly recommend going to your local Goodwill or thrift store and recycling yarn from sweaters. That is also a little tedious. I might do a stream about how I take apart sweaters and unravel them into yarn. So that's going to be it for now. I will do another one of these streams sometime this upcoming week. Maybe a weekday, but probably not until Sunday. And I'm going to get better at this. If you have any tips, send me a message because right now we could use all the help that we can get. Thanks for joining us.